I'm Damian Bassage. Welcome to California Frontier. Could we take a step back, and would you mind talking about how you got into archaeology in the first place?
Yes, I on a fourth grade field trip from Fresno, California. I ended up in Old Mission San Juan Bautista, and I remember standing there in the middle of that plaza and looking at all these ancient buildings and wondering about these histories. Up to that point, I really didn't have any academic leanings. I was a shoe shine boy. I was a bunch of things, and trying to make a living to help my family. And but that one trip was pivotal because what it did was it opened my eyes to a whole new world. In effect, having lived in the Central Valley, having been born in French Camp, California, I'd never seen the ocean, for example. And the bus trip took us out to Monterey, where I saw sea lions, and then on to Mission San Juan Bautista, where I saw what I deemed to be cowboys and Indians, the cowboys on horseback. And it was such a fascinating trip. Upon my return after an entire day to Fresno, my parents were scouring the neighborhood for my remains because they thought I'd been kidnapped. They didn't understand where I was going. They didn't understand why I was gone so long and why it was so late in the evening. And when I returned, I told them I'd seen sea monsters and I'd see cowboys and Indians. And they, of course, didn't believe me until well over 30 years later when they found my photographs. And so that's where I developed an initial understanding or beginnings of history for California. But I was so inspired by what I saw, I tried to recreate the town of San Juan Bautista by collecting tomato boxes, cutting them up, and building 22 buildings, log cabins, an old mission church. And then they were like doll houses. And I'd spend my days, reimagining that history. And then from that, my father got himself into some political problems that required lawyers. And so the attorneys suggested he might want to head out of the country for a little while. And we went to Mexico City. And there I saw the pyramids of Teotihuacan, the Aztec ruins. And then my fascination with this antiquity, this past, my ancestors really gelled. So those two dimensions, the missions and the pre-Columbian past, really animated my interest more in art history, but eventually it went into the area of archaeology. And archaeology, by virtue of the fact that I had applied for a grant, it was a graduate school grant at the California State University, Bakersfield. And I was a freshman at the time. I didn't know what a graduate student was. I wasn't from an academic background. I applied for it, and of course, they rejected it. But then I met Ignacio Bernal, one of the leading archaeologists in Mexico. And he happened to be in Bakersfield to do a talk at Bakersfield College, and I was invited to have lunch with him. I asked him to review my paper. He wrote me back, and then I was really determined. And I attended a Southwestern Anthropology Conference in Santa Fe. I gave that presentation. Then I won their National Graduate Student Paper Award. I received $500, and then my university was a little bit befuddled by this, and so the committee contacted me and asked me to let them reconsider my paper, and then they gave me an additional $500. So I kind of it was almost like double dipping, but I from that point on I was committed to archaeology, and I spent my summers engaged in native Californian archaeology along the Kern River through Bakersfield College, and then to some extent through Cal State Bakersfield, which really didn't have quite the archaeology program at that time anyway.
And then, so at that point, when you graduated, you decided to go on and do doctoral work in archaeology?
Yes, I pretty much resolved in that freshman year, that same paper that was awarded a $500 scholarship by the Southwestern Anthropological Association. It also came with publication. So I published my first paper as a freshman. And then about a year or two later, I met Wigberto Jimenez Moreno at a conference in San Francisco. And he invited me to Paris. And I told him, I said, I'm a jardinero. I'm a gardener. I don't have that kind of money. And he says, no, this is going to be a transformative experience for you. You need to get there. And so I literally spent my summer raising the money. I got in on literally a standby airline ticket for $325 to Europe. And I bought a $100 rail pass. I got to Paris, I presented at the Sorbonne, and in the middle of the presentation, the projector caught fire. And so you can imagine I was so devastated. But the plus side was that Wigberto had invited some of the premier archaeologists on Mesoamerican archaeology. For example, H.B. Nicholson was in the front row, Nigel Davies, a whole host of Warwick Bray, some of the biggest names in European archaeology in particular. And so I then, from that, had that paper published in 1977. And I decided, I need to go to graduate school. This is the only way I'm going to survive. And H.B. Nicholson, who was an Aztec specialist, tried to recruit me to Los Angeles, to UCLA. And I don't know if there were any perks for that. I just knew I don't want to leave Bakersfield, where I'm surrounded by gangs, and then go to LA and be surrounded by even bigger and more malicious gangs. So I was thinking on a level that really wasn't academic. So I chose the University of Arizona, and they weren't interested in my work. So I struggled there for years with really no mentor. And so, in sum, after years of that kind of work, I continued to travel into Mexico almost yearly on whatever money I happened to have to photograph archaeological sites. And for many years, I only photographed the pre-Hispanic sites. But invariably, no matter where I traveled, I would find myself looking at pre-Columbian ruins, which were within proximity of Spanish colonial churches. And I never took an interest in those churches until work that I was doing in Cholula, Puebla, in the summer of, This was 1993. And I found myself going into the church more often. Let's just say the archaeology wasn't going well, so I found myself going in there to pray. And in the process, I discovered the Spanish colonial tradition. Although I fully identify with my indigenous background, which is Yaqui Indian or Nevome. And so that has always been probably the main impulse for virtually everything I do in archaeology. I want to elevate the contributions of my ancestors, but it took me a long time to realize my ancestors were both indigenous and Hispanic. And so now I try to work with both traditions, but I find myself in the crosshairs of both camps. And so I'm all right with that because, as I always say, when it comes to the ancestors, I don't take sides.